There is a job posting that doesn't exist, but if it did, this is what it would actually say. Wanted, live, in Housemaid for a picture, perfect family on a sprawling estate. Duties include light cleaning, basic childcare, and the occasional homemade dinner. Salary excellent. Benefits generous. One small caveat buried in the fine print, easy to miss if you're desperate enough, if you're hungry enough, if you've got nowhere else left to go, you will be lied to. Repeatedly. By everyone in this house. And by the time you finally figure out who's lying to you and why, you may have already become a permanent character in someone else's plan for revenge. That's the job. That's the actual job description nobody puts on the listing, because if they did, no one desperate enough to need this particular job would ever be foolish enough to take it. But Millie takes it anyway. Because Millie doesn't have the luxury of reading fine print. Millie has a criminal record, a parole officer breathing down her neck, and exactly 0 other options left on the table. So when a gorgeous estate on Long Island, all manicured hedges and wrought iron gates, offers her a fresh start, a room of her own, a paycheck big enough to actually matter, she doesn't ask too many questions. She just says yes. And that's exactly what they were counting on. Tonight, we're stepping inside one of the most talked about thrillers of the year, a film that spent its entire opening hour quietly, deliberately, teaching its audience to root for exactly the wrong person, before yanking the floor out from under everyone watching and revealing a far more disturbing, far more calculated story underneath. A story about a wife who isn't crazy. A husband who isn't a victim. And a housemaid who came looking for a fresh start and ended up walking straight into someone else's carefully constructed trap. This is The Housemaid. Let's set the scene properly before we step inside the gates of this estate, because understanding how this film arrived in theaters tells you a lot about why it landed the way it did. The Housemaid is based on Frida McFadden's enormously popular 2022 novel of the same name, a book that became a viral sensation, the kind of word-of-mouth bestseller that dominates online book communities for months at a stretch, beloved for exactly the kind of lurid, escalating, twist-after-twist structure that makes for compulsive, can't-put-it-down reading. Adapting that kind of book for the screen is its own particular challenge, because so much of its appeal lives in the reader's own internal experience of being repeatedly fooled, repeatedly recalibrating their assumptions about who's the victim and who's the villain. The job of bringing that experience to the screen went to director Paul Feig, a name that might surprise some people walking in expecting a straight, humorless psychological thriller. Feig built his reputation on comedy, on Bridesmaids, on The Heat, on the 2016 Ghostbusters reboot, on a directorial sensibility built around sharp, character-driven ensemble work with a real comedic engine running underneath it. That background turns out to matter enormously to how this film actually plays, because Feig brings a heightened, almost gleefully theatrical sensibility to material that, in less playful hands, might have settled for grim, joyless melodrama. The screenplay was written by Rebecca Sonnenschein, known for her work on The Vampire Diaries and The Boys, 2 properties that both, in their own very different ways, understand how to balance genuine emotional stakes with escalating, sometimes outrageous plot machinery. The film assembled a genuinely starry cast to anchor its central triangle. Sydney Sweeney, fresh off a string of attention-grabbing roles, took on the lead role of Millie Calloway, the desperate young woman at the center of the story. Amanda Seyfried played Nina Winchester, the wealthy, seemingly perfect wife and mother who hires Millie, and whose true nature becomes the film's most carefully guarded secret. Brandon Sklenar played Andrew Winchester, Nina's charming, successful husband, a man the film spends its first half quietly, deliberately positioning as a sympathetic figure caught between 2 difficult women. Michelle Morone rounded out the principal cast as Enzo, the estate's groundskeeper, and Elizabeth Perkins appeared as Andrew's mother Evelyn, a woman whose brief but pointed appearances late in the film carry far more thematic weight than her limited screen time might initially suggest. Released in December of 2025, the film became a genuine commercial phenomenon, eventually grossing hundreds of millions of dollars worldwide against a relatively modest production budget, a return on investment that immediately greenlit a sequel based on McFadden's follow-up novel. Critical reception leaned positive, with reviewers consistently praising the film's gleeful, knowing embrace of erotic, thriller conventions from decades past, while some pointed out that its narrative ambitions occasionally outpaced its execution, the back half of the film leaning into a level of escalating melodrama that some viewers found exhilarating and others found exhausting. What almost everyone agreed on, regardless of where they ultimately landed on the film's overall quality, was that Amanda Seyfried's performance was the engine driving the entire thing, a portrayal so calibrated, so quietly devastating in its eventual reveal, that it elevated material that could have easily collapsed into pure camp into something with genuine, if heightened, emotional weight underneath all the twists. So let's step inside the gates, and watch exactly how this story builds its trap, one carefully placed brick at a time. The film introduces us to Millie Calloway in a state of genuine, grinding desperation. She's recently out of prison, on parole, struggling to find anyone willing to give a woman with a violent criminal record a second chance at employment. The specifics of her past conviction are revealed gradually rather than dumped on the audience all at once, a deliberate structural choice that keeps us slightly uncertain about exactly who Millie is and what she's actually capable of, planting a low hum of ambiguity around her character that the film will keep returning to and complicating throughout its runtime. This opening stretch matters enormously to everything that follows, because it establishes the specific kind of vulnerability that makes Millie exactly the right person for what's about to happen to her. She's not simply unemployed. She's cornered, boxed in by a system that's made it nearly impossible for her to rebuild any kind of normal life, desperate enough to overlook red flags she might otherwise notice, desperate enough to need this particular job to work out badly enough that she'll talk herself past warning signs a less cornered person might immediately recognize and flee from. When she arrives at the Winchester estate for her interview, the film leans hard into the visual and emotional language of aspirational wealth porn, sweeping driveways, manicured hedges, a house so large and so beautiful it practically functions as its own character. This isn't simply scene, setting. It's the film constructing, deliberately, the exact fantasy of escape and transformation that makes Millie, and by extension the audience, willing to overlook whatever oddities start surfacing once she's actually inside. Nina Winchester, the woman who interviews and ultimately hires her, is introduced as warm, gracious, seemingly the embodiment of effortless, wealthy domestic perfection, a woman who appears to have everything Millie has never had access to: stability, beauty, a family, a home, an entire life that looks, from the outside, like exactly the kind of fresh start Millie is desperately seeking for herself. This introduction is worth paying close attention to, because everything about it is constructed to set up the film's eventual reversal. Amanda Seyfried plays this early version of Nina with a specific, calibrated warmth, generous, a little anxious in a way that reads, on a first viewing, as simple new employer nervousness, the kind of person genuinely trying to make a good first impression rather than someone harboring any kind of hidden agenda. There's nothing in this introduction that telegraphs the eventual reveal. That restraint is important, because it means the film is playing entirely fair with its audience, building its eventual twist out of careful, retrospectively legible behavior rather than cheap, unearned misdirection. Millie moves into the estate, given a room in the attic, a detail the film makes sure to linger on just long enough to register as slightly unusual without yet tipping into outright alarm. The window is sealed. The door can be locked from the outside. These are small, almost throwaway details on a first pass through the story, but they're doing important structural work, planting physical, architectural details that will return with devastating new meaning by the time the film reaches its climax. It's almost immediately after Millie settles into her new role that Nina's behavior starts shifting, and this shift is where the film begins constructing the elaborate misdirection that defines its entire first half. Nina erupts at Millie over a seemingly minor mistake, accusing her, falsely, of throwing away important notes. The outburst is sudden, disproportionate, the kind of behavior that immediately recalibrates our understanding of this woman we just met as warm and gracious. Soon after, Nina threatens to fire Millie outright, and explicitly warns her to stay away from Andrew, Nina's husband, who Millie has barely interacted with at this point in the story. This sequence of escalating, seemingly irrational hostility is the film's central misdirection engine, and it's worth appreciating how carefully constructed it actually is. The audience, like Millie herself, has no reason at this point to read Nina's behavior as anything other than genuine instability, jealousy, or cruelty. We're given no information suggesting an alternative explanation. We're simply shown a woman behaving erratically and cruelly towards someone who appears, by every available metric, to be an innocent, hard-working employee just trying to keep her job and stay out of trouble. Meanwhile, Andrew Winchester is being constructed, in careful parallel, as exactly the opposite kind of figure. Brandon Sklenar plays him with an easy, attentive charm, someone who seems genuinely concerned about Millie's treatment within his own household, someone who positions himself, repeatedly, as a kind of quiet ally against his wife's apparently irrational hostility. The film builds, deliberately and patiently, a growing sense of sympathy between Millie and Andrew, a sense that here, finally, is someone in this strange, beautiful, unsettling house who actually sees her, who treats her with basic human decency in a household otherwise defined by Nina's volatile cruelty. This is the section of the film Paul Feig has been quite open about discussing in interviews, explaining that the entire architecture of the first half is built specifically to make the audience root, wholeheartedly, for exactly the dynamic the film is eventually going to reveal as catastrophically, dangerously wrong. We're meant to want Millie and Andrew to grow closer. We're meant to want Nina out of the picture, removed as an obstacle to whatever happiness Millie might find in this house. The film is playing a long, patient game with audience sympathy, and it's worth recognizing just how disciplined that game actually is, because it requires every single scene in this stretch of the film to function on two levels simultaneously, a surface level that makes complete emotional sense on a first viewing, and a hidden level that will retroactively reveal itself as something far more calculated once the eventual reversal lands. There's a particularly important sequence involving an heirloom plate, part of an irreplaceable china collection belonging to Andrew's mother, that deserves real attention, because it functions as the hinge connecting the film's two halves. Millie, startled by the unsettling, lingering presence of Enzo the groundskeeper staring at her through a window, drops a tray she's carrying, shattering one of these heirloom plates. Andrew, in response, fires Enzo, removing him from the household, and then asks Millie to clean up and save the broken pieces so he can bring them to a specialist for repair. That detail, the saved, broken pieces of china, plants a seed that will detonate with real horror later in the film, but on a first pass, it simply reads as a small domestic inconvenience, an excuse for Andrew and Millie to spend more time together as he deals with the aftermath. When he returns home that evening to find the dirty pieces still sitting where Millie left them, he persuades her to follow him upstairs to her attic bedroom, and the relationship the film has been quietly building toward across its entire first half finally, inevitably, crosses into physical intimacy. This is the moment the film has been engineering its audience toward for an hour of careful, patient construction, and it's worth recognizing the specific, uncomfortable cleverness of what Feig described wanting to accomplish here. The audience, having spent the entire first half watching Nina behave cruelly and erratically while Andrew behaves with apparent kindness and understanding, is positioned to feel something close to relief, even triumph, watching this moment unfold. Millie has found someone in this house who sees her, who wants her, who offers an escape from Nina's apparent instability. The film wants you to feel good about this. It wants you to root for it. And then it pulls the floor out entirely. The morning after, Millie wakes to find herself alone, the door to her attic room locked from the outside. Andrew's voice comes from the stairwell, and the warmth that's defined every previous interaction between them has vanished completely, replaced by something colder, more controlling, unmistakably menacing. He informs her that she will not be let out of this room until she completes a specific, horrifying task, carving 20-1 deep cuts into her own stomach using a piece of the broken heirloom plate she'd been instructed to save. This is the film's central rupture point, the moment where everything the audience has been led to believe across the entire preceding runtime collapses and rebuilds itself into something far darker and more disturbing. Andrew isn't the kind, sympathetic figure he spent an hour presenting himself as. He's controlling, sadistic, capable of genuine, calculated cruelty, and the warmth he displayed toward Millie wasn't affection in any genuine sense. It was, we begin to understand, performance, a tool of manipulation no different in kind from whatever cruelty Nina was displaying earlier, just dressed in more palatable, more seductive packaging. The horror of this sequence is handled by the film with genuine, sustained discomfort rather than cheap shock value. Millie resists for as long as she possibly can, the film letting the agony and humiliation of her situation breathe rather than rushing through it for the sake of plot momentum. When she finally, after exhausting every other option, complies with Andrew's demand, carving the wounds into her own body and sliding the bloodied piece of plate under the door as instructed, the film asks its audience to sit in the full, sickening weight of what's just been done to her, the specific violation of being forced into self-harm as a condition of basic freedom. But this is also, crucially, the moment Millie stops being simply a victim within this story and starts becoming an active agent fighting back against it. When Andrew enters the room afterward, finding her seemingly compliant, seemingly broken, she allows him to believe, for just long enough, that his cruelty has achieved exactly what he intended. And then she turns the tables entirely, stabbing him with a cheese knife she'd managed to hide, fighting through a brutal, desperate scuffle, ultimately seizing his phone and the knife and locking him inside the very room he'd been using to imprison her. It's a genuinely cathartic reversal, the film finally allowing its audience the release of watching Millie fight back against the specific horror she's just survived. But it's also, crucially, not yet the film's final reveal. There's a deeper, more architecturally significant twist still waiting underneath this one. Because here's what we eventually learn: Nina knew. Nina had always known, or at least suspected, exactly what Andrew was capable of, and her apparently erratic, cruel behavior toward Millie throughout the entire first half of the film wasn't instability at all. It was strategy. Calculated, deliberate strategy, designed with a specific, devastating purpose, to push Andrew's attention toward Millie, to position Millie as exactly the kind of vulnerable, desperate target Andrew's particular brand of predatory charm and control would inevitably gravitate toward, so that his true nature, his actual capacity for cruelty and control, would finally reveal itself undeniably, to Millie, to Nina, to anyone watching. This is the film's true architectural reveal, the twist that recontextualizes literally every single scene that preceded it. Nina's cruelty toward Millie wasn't simple jealousy or instability. It was a deliberate, almost surgical act of manipulation, weaponizing exactly the kind of dynamic Andrew has apparently exploited before, the savior complex he displays toward vulnerable young women under his roof, turning that exact pattern back against him by essentially placing bait directly in his path. Let's sit with the implications of that reveal for a moment, because it's genuinely more sophisticated, and considerably darker, than a simple "the seemingly crazy wife was right all along" twist. Nina isn't simply revealed to be innocent. She's revealed to have orchestrated, with full knowledge and intention, a situation that placed another vulnerable woman directly in harm's way, gambling, with calculated coldness, that Millie's specific history, her capacity for violence, demonstrated by her own criminal record, would make her capable of fighting back against Andrew once his true nature finally surfaced, in a way that Nina herself, trapped in this marriage for years, had apparently never felt capable of doing on her own. That's a genuinely uncomfortable, morally complicated piece of storytelling, and it's worth giving the film credit for not softening it into something more comfortably heroic. Nina isn't simply a victim who finally gets justice. She's a woman who survived years of psychological abuse and control by becoming, in her own way, every bit as calculating and willing to sacrifice others as the man controlling her, using Millie's desperation and vulnerability as a tool in her own escape plan, fully aware of the risk and harm that plan exposed Millie to in the process. The film doesn't ask its audience to simply forgive this. It asks something more complicated, that we hold both truths simultaneously, that Nina's actions are genuinely manipulative and morally troubling, and that the specific horror of what she survived for years under Andrew's control makes her desperation to escape, by whatever means necessary, deeply, painfully understandable. That moral complexity is, frankly, more interesting than a simpler, more conventionally satisfying revenge narrative would have allowed for.
After Millie locks Andrew in the attic, Nina's plan accelerates toward its conclusion. She makes a brief attempt to flee entirely with her daughter Cece, apparently intending to simply walk away from the entire situation now that her plan has, in a sense, succeeded in exposing Andrew's true nature. But it's Cece herself, in a small but important narrative beat, who convinces her mother that they can't simply abandon Millie to whatever's happening back at the house, that some obligation remains toward the woman Nina deliberately placed in this position. This detail matters, because it's the film's way of allowing Nina a moment of genuine, uncalculated moral conscience, distinct from the cold strategic thinking that's defined her behavior throughout the rest of the story. Her daughter's insistence that they return functions as a kind of moral corrective, a reminder that whatever Nina's justified grievances against Andrew, she still bears genuine responsibility for what she's done to Millie, and that responsibility demands a response beyond simply walking away once her own escape has been secured. The film's climax brings Nina and Millie together, now functioning as allies rather than antagonists. The entire earlier dynamic the film spent an hour constructing now fully inverted into something resembling solidarity. Andrew, freed or escaping from the attic, becomes the film's final, unambiguous threat, and the confrontation that follows ends with his death, pushed by Millie over the edge of the estate's dramatic spiral staircase, a fall that the film stages with real visual flourish, the kind of operatic, almost theatrical violence that signals the story has fully shifted from psychological thriller into something closer to outright vigilante catharsis. In the aftermath, the local police investigation, embodied by a detective named Jessica Connors, raises some pointed questions about the official explanation offered for Andrew's death, questions that carry an additional layer of personal resonance once we learn that Jessica's own sister had once been engaged to Andrew, an engagement that ended, we're given to understand, traumatically. That detail does important quiet work for the film's broader thematic argument, suggesting that Andrew's pattern of control and cruelty extends well beyond his marriage to Nina, that this is a man with an established history of this exact behavior, recognized, even if only informally, by people within his own community. Ultimately, Jessica chooses to rule Andrew's death an accident, closing the investigation rather than pursuing the more complicated, more dangerous truth underneath it. That choice functions as the film's final piece of moral ambiguity, justice arriving not through any official, sanctioned channel, but through a kind of quiet, unspoken complicity among women who recognize, even without explicitly discussing it, exactly what kind of man Andrew actually was, and exactly what kind of justice his death actually represents. The film's final stretch settles into a deliberately unsettling, quietly chilling coda. At Andrew's funeral, Nina meets his mother Evelyn, and in a brief but pointed exchange, comes to understand that Andrew himself was likely shaped by his own experience of abuse and control growing up in this same family, that whatever cruelty he inflicted on the women in his life was, in some sense, simply an inherited pattern passed down rather than entirely original to him. This detail doesn't excuse Andrew's behavior. The film is careful not to frame it as exculpatory, but it does add a final, melancholy layer of context to everything that's preceded it. The suggestion that cycles of control and abuse don't simply begin and end with any single individual, but propagate across generations until someone, somewhere, finally finds a way to break the pattern, however imperfectly, however morally complicated that breaking ultimately turns out to be. Nina gives Millie a substantial financial settlement, a gesture that functions as both genuine gratitude and a kind of uneasy moral transaction, payment for services rendered, however dark and complicated those services actually were. She then leaves to start a new life with Cece, the explicit goal she'd been working toward across her entire elaborate plan finally achieved. And then comes the film's final, deliberately unsettling scene, the one that recontextualizes everything we've just watched into something with much larger, more disturbing implications. Millie, having survived her ordeal, having received her payment, is shown interviewing for a new housemaid position, this time with a woman who, we learn, was recommended specifically by Nina. The woman hints, carefully, delicately, that her own husband is difficult, abusive, that she might need help dealing with him. And Millie, without hesitation, without any of the desperate uncertainty that defined her character at the start of the film, asks simply when she can start, responding to the implicit proposition with chilling, unbothered ease. This final beat transforms the entire film, retroactively, from a single, contained domestic thriller into the origin story of something considerably larger and more disturbing, an entire underground network, operating quietly beneath the surface of polite, wealthy domestic life, in which women trapped in abusive marriages identify and recruit specific, capable individuals, people like Millie, with both the desperation and the demonstrated capacity for violence necessary to do what needs to be done, to deal, permanently, with men who can't be escaped through any conventional, legal means. Let's step back now and really dig into what's actually happening underneath all of this escalating, increasingly operatic plotting, because there's a genuine thematic architecture here worth taking seriously, even amid all the heightened, sometimes outrageous melodrama. At its core, this is a story interested in interrogating exactly how abuse and control operate within seemingly perfect, wealthy domestic spaces, and crucially, how those dynamics are consistently misread by outside observers, including, the film argues pointedly, by the audience itself. The entire structure of the first half is built specifically to exploit and then expose a set of assumptions the audience brings into the theater largely unconsciously, assumptions about who's likely to be the villain in a story like this, the volatile, seemingly unstable wife or the charming, sympathetic husband. And the film deliberately manipulates those assumptions before revealing, with real thematic precision, exactly how dangerous and naive they actually are. This is, in its own heightened, genre, thriller way, a meaningful piece of commentary on how abusive dynamics actually function, and specifically on how effectively abusers can weaponize sympathy and apparent reasonableness against their victims, making the victim's own desperate, sometimes erratic survival behaviors look, to outside observers, like the actual instability, while the abuser's calm, charming exterior reads as innocence. Nina's apparent cruelty throughout the film's first half isn't simply a clever plot device. It's a dramatization of exactly the kind of behavior abuse survivors often display, behavior that gets misread by courts, by communities, by audiences trained on conventional genre expectations, as evidence against them rather than evidence of what they've actually survived. That's a genuinely substantive thematic foundation underneath all the heightened plotting, and it's worth giving the film credit for building its entire twist structure around exposing exactly this kind of misreading, rather than simply deploying a twist for its own shock value. The reveal doesn't just surprise the audience. It implicates them, retroactively, in exactly the kind of assumptions the film is critiquing. Andrew's characterization deserves attention too, because the film resists the temptation to make him simply, straightforwardly evil from the outset, instead building him carefully as someone whose apparent charm and reasonableness are entirely real, entirely functional tools of manipulation rather than a thin disguise over obvious menace. That's a more unsettling, more thematically honest depiction of this kind of controlling, abusive personality than a more cartoonish villain would have allowed for. The genuine difficulty of recognizing this kind of person before it's too late is exactly the point. Andrew isn't unconvincing as a sympathetic figure. He's entirely convincing, which is precisely what makes him so dangerous, and precisely what makes Nina's elaborate, morally compromised plan to expose him feel, however uncomfortable, somewhat necessary within the film's own internal logic. Millie's arc carries its own thematic weight as well, functioning as a story about the specific vulnerability created by desperation and a lack of social safety net. Her criminal record, her parole status, her total lack of other options, all of it makes her precisely the kind of person who can be maneuvered into a dangerous situation by someone with the resources and patience to engineer it. And the film is quietly pointed in suggesting that this isn't simply Millie's individual misfortune, but a systemic vulnerability. The way society's general unwillingness to extend genuine second chances to people with criminal histories leaves exactly the kind of desperate, cornered population that predatory, controlling people can exploit. There's also something worth noting in how the film handles Millie's final transformation into something resembling a recurring agent of vigilante justice. The ending doesn't frame this transformation as straightforwardly triumphant. There's a coldness to her final line, an unbothered ease in response to an implicit proposition to potentially harm another man, that the film allows to sit uncomfortably rather than packaging as pure, uncomplicated empowerment. Millie has survived genuine horror, and she's emerged from that horror changed in ways that are genuinely satisfying on a pure genre catharsis level, but also genuinely unsettling if you sit with the implications for more than a moment. She's become exactly the kind of person capable of doing what needs to be done, and the film leaves it ambiguous whether that transformation should be read as purely heroic or as its own kind of tragedy, a young woman whose path toward any kind of normal, stable life has been permanently foreclosed, replaced instead by a new identity built entirely around violence in service of other women's survival. Let's talk for a moment about the craftsmanship behind all of this, because the film's tonal balancing act deserves real, specific attention. Paul Feig's comedic background turns out to be an asset rather than a liability here, bringing a heightened, knowing theatricality to material that could have easily collapsed into either dour, joyless melodrama or unintentional camp. The film consistently seems aware of exactly how outrageous certain of its plot beats actually are, and rather than playing them with straight-faced solemnity, it leans into a kind of gleeful, maximalist energy, particularly in its back half, that invites the audience to enjoy the escalating absurdity rather than simply endure it. That's a difficult tonal needle to thread, and the film doesn't always thread it perfectly. Certain sequences tip fully into a kind of operatic excess that some viewers found exhilarating and others found simply exhausting, but the overall confidence of the approach deserves real credit. The central performances carry an enormous amount of weight throughout, and it's worth examining each of them in turn. Amanda Seyfried's work as Nina is, by wide critical consensus, the film's most effective element, requiring her to play an entire arc of carefully calibrated misdirection, convincing as both apparent instability and, retroactively, as cold, strategic calculation, without ever tipping her hand prematurely in either direction. That's an enormously difficult balancing act, and Seyfried's performance is precise enough that the eventual reveal feels earned rather than simply sprung on the audience without warning. Sydney Sweeney's performance as Millie received more divided reactions, with some viewers and critics praising her embodiment of the character's escalating transformation from desperate victim to capable, dangerous agent, and others finding her performance somewhat flat in its earlier, more vulnerable stretches. There's a reasonable argument that the character's arc, by design, asks for a kind of emotional opacity in its early scenes, keeping Millie's interior life somewhat withheld from the audience as part of the film's broader strategy of withholding information, and that this opacity reads, to some viewers, as simply uneven acting rather than a deliberate character choice. Brandon Sklenar, for his part, handles the film's most difficult tonal challenge effectively, required to be genuinely charming and sympathetic for roughly half the runtime before revealing, convincingly, the controlling menace underneath, a transition that needs to feel like a genuine unmasking rather than a personality switch, and largely succeeds in pulling that transition off. If there are legitimate critiques to level against the film, beyond the divided reception toward individual performances, they tend to cluster around its plotting in the back half, occasionally prioritizing escalating spectacle over psychological plausibility. Certain late Film development stretching credibility in ways that ask the audience to simply go along with the heightened genre logic rather than interrogate it too closely. Some critics also noted that the film's themes, while genuinely substantive underneath the surface, occasionally get buried under the sheer volume and velocity of plot mechanics, twist after twist arriving in rapid succession in ways that can make it difficult to fully process the thematic weight of any single revelation before the next one arrives to complicate it further. But measured against the specific genre tradition it's deliberately invoking, the lurid, twist-heavy erotic and domestic thrillers of decades past, films built explicitly around the pleasure of having your sympathies repeatedly manipulated and your assumptions repeatedly upended, the film succeeds quite effectively at delivering exactly that specific, heightened pleasure, while smuggling in enough genuine thematic substance about abuse, manipulation, and the systemic vulnerabilities that make people exploitable to elevate it meaningfully above simple, empty genre exercise. So where does that leave us, at the end of this particular twisted, escalating story? The Housemaid succeeds, ultimately, because it understands exactly what kind of pleasure its audience is showing up for, and delivers that pleasure with real confidence and real craft, while using its central twist structure to make a genuinely pointed argument about how easily abuse dynamics get misread, both by the people living inside them and by everyone watching from outside. It's a film that asks you to root for exactly the wrong people, then forces you to sit with the discomfort of having done so, before finally offering a kind of dark, morally complicated catharsis that refuses to fully resolve into simple, comfortable triumph. Final rating, 7 out of 10. A gleefully heightened, confidently executed throwback to a beloved genre tradition, anchored by a genuinely excellent central performance that occasionally prioritizes escalating spectacle over deeper plausibility, but never loses sight of the genuine thematic substance underneath all its twists, and earns its uncomfortable, ambiguous final note far more than its marketing as straightforward thriller fun might initially suggest. If this breakdown gave you a deeper appreciation for exactly how this film built and then dismantled your sympathies, let me know in the comments which twist actually got you. And if you want more deep dive cinematic recaps just like this one, make sure you're subscribed, because there are plenty more twisted stories left to unpack. Let's slow down even further on a few more threads, because there's enough careful construction running through this film that it genuinely rewards real, patient attention rather than a quick first-pass summary. Let's go back to the very architecture of the house itself, because the film treats the Winchester estate almost as a character in its own right, and that choice deserves real attention. Every space inside this house is doing quiet symbolic work throughout the story. The sprawling, sunlit common areas, the kitchen, the dining room, the grand staircase that eventually becomes the site of the film's climactic death, are spaces of performance, places where the family's curated, perfect surface gets maintained and displayed for visitors, for each other, for the world. The attic, by contrast, sealed window and all, exterior lock and all, is the space of genuine truth, the place where the household's actual power dynamics finally reveal themselves without any of the polish or pretense on display everywhere else in the house. That spatial logic matters enormously to how the film's climax eventually plays out. It's not incidental that Andrew's downfall happens on the grand staircase, the most theatrical, most visually impressive space in the entire house, the literal architecture of performed wealth and status finally becoming the site of his undoing. And it's not incidental that the attic, the space of genuine, unperformed cruelty, is also the space where Millie finally, decisively stops performing vulnerability and starts actively fighting back. The film is using its setting with real intentionality, letting the house's own geography track the story's gradual movement from surface-level performance toward underlying, uncomfortable truth. Let's also spend more time examining the specific texture of Millie's early desperation, because the film does careful work establishing exactly how narrow her options actually are before she ever sets foot inside the Winchester estate. The scenes depicting her struggle to find any kind of employment with a criminal record aren't simply quick, perfunctory scene setting. They're establishing, with real specificity, the systemic machinery that makes someone like Millie exploitable in the first place. Every door that closes on her, every interview that ends the moment her record comes up, every small humiliation of trying to rebuild a life that the world has already decided to write off, accumulates into a portrait of exactly how narrow the path becomes for people attempting to re-enter society after incarceration. That accumulated desperation isn't simply backstory. It's the entire mechanism that makes the rest of the plot possible. Nina doesn't need to manufacture vulnerability in Millie. She simply needs to recognize and capitalize on vulnerability that an entire unforgiving system has already created.
This detail also complicates any simple reading of Nina as purely calculating or purely sympathetic. She's not creating Millie's desperation. She's identifying it, recognizing it as useful, and deploying it toward her own ends, which is its own specific, uncomfortable kind of exploitation. Even if the larger goal it's serving, escaping a controlling, abusive marriage, carries genuine sympathy. The film doesn't ask you to resolve that tension cleanly. It asks you to feel the discomfort of it, to recognize that survival sometimes requires using other vulnerable people as instruments, and that this reality doesn't fully redeem the person doing the using, even when their underlying motivation is genuinely understandable. Let's also take a slower look at the specific dynamic between Millie and Andrew during the stretch of the film where their relationship is being built up as the emotional center of the story, because there's careful, deliberate craft in exactly how that seduction is staged. Andrew's attentiveness toward Millie throughout this stretch isn't simply generic romantic interest. It's calibrated, specifically, toward the exact things Millie is most starved for in her current circumstances: validation, a sense of being seen as more than her criminal record, a feeling of safety and stability after years of having neither. Watch how often his kindness toward her takes the specific form of defending her against Nina's apparent cruelty, positioning himself, consistently, as her protector against an unstable threat. That's not accidental. It's the precise mechanism by which this specific kind of controlling personality typically operates, identifying a person's particular wound and then positioning themselves as the exact remedy for that wound, building dependency and gratitude before ever revealing the cost of that arrangement. This is worth dwelling on, because it's exactly the pattern the film is interested in dramatizing and critiquing: the way genuinely controlling, abusive people frequently don't present as obviously menacing from the outset. They present as exactly what their target is most desperate for, which is precisely what makes them so difficult to recognize and so dangerous once their true nature finally surfaces. Andrew's charm toward Millie isn't a mask concealing his true self in some simple sense. It's an accurate reflection of one genuine capability he possesses: the ability to identify and provide exactly what a vulnerable person needs, deployed here not out of genuine care, but as a tool of control that only reveals its true purpose once Millie is sufficiently dependent and isolated for the more overtly controlling behavior to begin. Let's also examine more closely the specific staging of the attic confrontation, because there's more deliberate craft in how that sequence escalates than a quick summary usually captures. The film takes real care in how it sequences Millie's resistance before she eventually complies with Andrew's demand. She doesn't simply give in immediately, and she doesn't maintain unbroken defiance throughout either. The film shows her trying multiple strategies first, attempting to reason with him, attempting to find some alternative way out of the room, exhausting every other option before finally, with genuine reluctance and horror, committing the act of self-harm he's demanding. That sequencing matters, because it establishes, with real specificity, exactly how someone arrives at a decision like this, not through simple, immediate capitulation, but through the genuine, desperate exhaustion of every other available option. A person doing everything they can think of to avoid an impossible choice before finally, devastatingly, making it anyway. This careful sequencing also sets up the emotional logic of her subsequent retaliation more effectively. Because the film has shown us the genuine cost, the genuine horror, of what she's just been forced to do, her decision to fight back the moment an opportunity presents itself doesn't feel like a sudden, unmotivated shift in character. It feels like the inevitable, earned culmination of exactly how much she's just survived, a person who has been pushed to an absolute limit finally, decisively refusing to be pushed any further. Let's also revisit, more slowly, the specific moment Nina's true plan and motivations are revealed, because the timing and staging of that reveal deserves careful attention. The film doesn't simply have a character explain Nina's plan in a single expository monologue, dumping the entire backstory on the audience at once. Instead, the revelation accumulates through a combination of context, behavior, and implication, forcing the audience to actively reassemble their understanding of everything they've previously watched rather than simply being told what to think. That's a more demanding, but ultimately more satisfying, structural choice, because it means the audience experiences something close to the same recalibration Millie herself is presumably going through, watching the entire architecture of the preceding hour rearrange itself into a completely different shape in real time. There's a particular detail worth highlighting in how this reveal connects back to Nina's earlier behavior throughout the film. Once you understand her actual plan, certain small moments that initially read as simple cruelty or instability reveal themselves, on reflection, as careful strategic positioning. Her insistence that Millie stay away from Andrew, delivered with apparent jealous hostility, actually functions as exactly the kind of forbidden fruit framing that would make Andrew's eventual interest in Millie feel more compelling and more secretive to him, exactly the dynamic Nina needed to engineer for her plan to succeed. The film is rewarding close attention here, planting details that function one way on a first viewing and an entirely different way once the full context becomes available. Let's also spend more time on the specific emotional texture of the alliance that eventually forms between Nina and Millie in the film's final stretch, because it's worth examining exactly how the film earns, or doesn't fully earn, that shift from antagonism to solidarity. There's an inherent difficulty in pivoting two characters from adversarial to allied within a relatively compressed amount of screen time, and the film handles this transition with mixed but generally effective success. It helps that both women have, by this point, survived a shared, specific horror at Andrew's hands, even if Nina's exposure to that horror predates the film's events and Millie's happens within it. That shared experience of having been controlled, manipulated, and ultimately endangered by the same man provides a foundation for solidarity that doesn't require the film to fully resolve or excuse the genuine harm Nina's plan caused Millie along the way. The alliance that forms isn't framed as Millie simply forgiving Nina outright. It's framed more as a pragmatic, mutually beneficial recognition that they're now facing a shared threat together, with the deeper emotional reckoning between them left deliberately unresolved, simmering underneath their cooperation rather than fully addressed and settled. That ambiguity is, frankly, more honest than a tidier resolution would have been. Real betrayal, even betrayal undertaken for understandable reasons, doesn't simply evaporate the moment circumstances demand cooperation. The film seems aware of this, choosing to let Nina and Millie's alliance carry an undercurrent of unresolved tension rather than papering over the genuine harm Nina's manipulation caused with a simple, clean reconciliation. Let's go back, too, to the climactic confrontation on the staircase, because the specific choreography and staging of that sequence carries more meaning than a simple action beat. The film stages Andrew's death as a moment of shared culpability between Nina and Millie rather than attributing it cleanly to either one of them alone. That choice matters thematically, because it means neither woman bears sole responsibility for what happens. The act of finally stopping Andrew becomes something they accomplish together, a final, violent culmination of the solidarity the film has been building between them across its back half. However imperfect and conditional that solidarity actually is. There's something quietly significant in that framing, the suggestion that escaping this particular kind of entrenched, protected cruelty sometimes requires more than any single person acting alone, that it takes a combination of different kinds of vulnerability and different kinds of capability working in concert to finally bring down someone as practiced and protected in his cruelty as Andrew has clearly become. Let's also take one more careful look at the funeral sequence, because the specific social performance on display in that scene mirrors, in a quieter key, exactly the kind of performance the film critiqued throughout its earlier runtime. Watch how the community surrounding the Winchester family responds to Andrew's death, the genuine grief on display from people who knew him only through his carefully maintained public persona. The eulogies that presumably celebrate exactly the kind of charm and apparent decency that Nina and Millie now understand to have been calculated and weaponized. That gap between public perception and private reality, on full display at this funeral, is the film's final, pointed reminder of exactly how effectively this kind of controlling, abusive personality manages to maintain a separate, entirely convincing public identity, one that persists and gets mourned even after the private truth has been violently, irreversibly exposed to the small handful of people who actually experienced it. That detail also reinforces why Nina's plan needed to be as elaborate and as covert as it was throughout the entire film. A man this thoroughly insulated by social performance and community goodwill couldn't simply be exposed through accusation alone. The film is quietly arguing that conventional, socially sanctioned paths toward accountability, public exposure, legal proceedings, community intervention, were never realistically available to Nina given exactly how successfully Andrew had constructed and maintained his public reputation. That absence of viable conventional recourse is precisely what makes her elaborate, morally troubling plan feel, within the film's own internal logic, like the only path that ever actually had a realistic chance of working. Let's close out this deeper pass by returning, one final time, to that unsettling closing scene, because I think it deserves one more careful look at exactly how it's staged and performed. Sydney Sweeney's delivery of Millie's final line carries a deliberate flatness, an absence of hesitation or visible internal conflict, that the film clearly intends as unsettling rather than simply triumphant. This isn't a woman relishing some hard-won sense of empowerment. It's a woman who has, in a very real sense, been fundamentally reshaped by everything she's survived, settling into a new identity with a kind of chilling, practiced ease that suggests this won't be a one-time act of necessary violence, but rather the beginning of an ongoing pattern, a new vocation built entirely around exactly the specific skill set her trauma has equipped her with. That ambiguity, refusing to definitively frame Millie's transformation as either purely heroic or purely tragic, is ultimately the most interesting choice the film makes in its entire runtime. It would have been easy, and arguably more conventionally satisfying, to end on a clean note of triumphant justice, the wronged woman finally empowered, finally free, finally capable of protecting herself and others. Instead, the film leaves you with something more uncomfortable, a recognition that the specific kind of justice this story has been building toward across its entire runtime comes at a real cost, the cost of a young woman's entire future identity being permanently reshaped around violence and secrecy. However understandable and even necessary that reshaping might be given everything that's led her to this point. Final rating: 7 out of 10. A gleefully heightened, confidently executed throwback to a beloved genre tradition, anchored by a genuinely excellent central performance, that occasionally prioritizes escalating spectacle over deeper plausibility, but never loses sight of the genuine thematic substance underneath all its twists, and earns its uncomfortable, ambiguous final note far more than its marketing as straightforward thriller fun might initially suggest. If this breakdown gave you a deeper appreciation for exactly how this film built and then dismantled your sympathies, let me know in the comments which twist actually got you. And if you want more deep dive cinematic recaps just like this one, make sure you're subscribed, because there are plenty more twisted stories left to unpack. Let's revisit the very first interview scene between Millie and Nina, because once you know the eventual reveal, that scene plays completely differently on a rewatch than it does the first time through. On a first viewing, Nina's warmth reads as simple, genuine kindness, a wealthy woman extending basic decency to a desperate job applicant. But watch her more carefully once you know what we eventually learn about her actual plan. There's a specific, careful attentiveness in the questions she asks Millie during that interview, questions about her past, about what she's looking for in this position, about how long she's willing to commit to staying. Those questions read, on a second pass, less like standard interview small talk and more like careful, deliberate profiling, a woman assessing whether this particular candidate has exactly the specific combination of desperation, vulnerability, and demonstrated capacity for self-protection that her actual plan requires. That's worth appreciating as a piece of screenwriting craft, because it means the eventual twist isn't simply sprung on the audience out of nowhere. The information was there all along, encoded into a scene that reads completely differently once you understand what it's actually establishing. Good twist construction doesn't lie to its audience. It simply withholds context, and this scene is a clean example of exactly that kind of fair, well-constructed misdirection. Let's also go back to the specific staging of Nina's early outbursts at Millie, because there's a deliberate theatricality to them that's worth noticing on a second viewing. Watch how often these outbursts happen specifically when Andrew is nearby, or likely to hear about them secondhand. That's not coincidental. Nina isn't simply losing her temper in private moments of genuine frustration. She's performing, specifically, for an audience of one, constructing exactly the kind of narrative about herself, unstable, irrational, cruel to the household help, that will make Andrew's eventual gravitation toward Millie feel, to him, like simple decency rather than anything he needs to feel guilty about. That's a genuinely clever piece of character work, because it means Nina's apparent instability throughout the first half isn't simply a misdirection trick played on the audience. It's also, simultaneously, an active tool within the story's own internal logic, a performance specifically calibrated to manipulate her husband into behaving exactly the way she needs him to behave for her plan to succeed. The film is doing double duty with these scenes, fooling the audience while also showing us, in retrospect, a woman executing a carefully designed strategy in real time. Let's spend more time on the heirloom plates sequence too, because there's a small but meaningful detail worth highlighting. Andrew's specific reaction to the broken plate, his focus on having it repaired rather than simply replaced, says something quietly important about his character that the film doesn't dwell on, but that's worth noticing. This is a man preoccupied with the appearance of preservation, with maintaining the illusion that nothing has actually been broken or lost, even when something demonstrably has. That preoccupation with surface level repair over genuine acknowledgement of damage ends up being a fairly precise metaphor for his approach to his entire marriage and his entire pattern of behavior toward the women in his life. Andrew doesn't want things fixed in any real sense. He wants them to look fixed, to present as undamaged, regardless of what's actually happening underneath that careful, curated surface. That detail also recontextualizes his treatment of Millie during the attic sequence. His insistence on a specific number of cuts, a precise, almost ritualistic act of punishment and supposed atonement, mirrors that same underlying psychology, an obsession with controlled, performed restoration rather than any genuine reckoning with harm actually done. He's not interested in Millie's genuine well-being any more than he was interested in the plate's genuine structural integrity. He's interested in the appearance of things being set right according to his own specific, controlling standards. Let's also revisit Detective Jessica Connor's brief but important role in the film's final stretch, because her personal connection to Andrew's history deserves a slightly longer look than the plot affords it directly. The fact that her own sister was previously engaged to Andrew, and that this engagement ended in some kind of trauma the film leaves deliberately vague rather than fully explaining, does important work in expanding the scope of Andrew's pattern of behavior beyond just his marriage to Nina. This detail suggests, without ever stating it outright, that Andrew has likely repeated this exact cycle, charm followed by escalating control followed by genuine cruelty, multiple times across multiple relationships, that Nina and Millie are not unique victims of some isolated aberration, but simply the most recent entries in an established, ongoing pattern. That detail also recontextualizes Jessica's final decision to rule Andrew's death an accident rather than pursuing a more thorough investigation. She's not simply being lazy or incompetent in her police work. She's making a choice, informed by her own personal history with this exact man, to allow a particular kind of rough justice to stand rather than disturbing it. That's a quietly significant piece of moral complexity tucked into a relatively small supporting role, suggesting that the network of complicity and quiet understanding among women who've encountered Andrew's particular brand of cruelty extends even into the institutions nominally responsible for investigating and punishing exactly this kind of crime. Let's also spend a bit more time on Evelyn, Andrew's mother, because her brief appearance at the funeral carries more thematic weight than its limited screen time might initially suggest. The revelation that Andrew himself likely grew up under his mother's own particular brand of perfectionist control and cruelty doesn't function, within the film's logic, as an excuse for his behavior. The film is careful not to suggest that being shaped by abuse simply absolves someone of the harm they go on to inflict on others. But it does add a final, melancholy layer of context to the entire story, suggesting that the specific cruelty on display throughout this film didn't originate with Andrew, that it's been passed down, generation to generation, a pattern of control and perfectionism curdling into outright abuse that nobody in this family seems to have ever successfully interrupted, until Nina's elaborate, morally fraught plan finally, violently broke the cycle, at least for this specific branch of it. That detail gives the film's ending a quieter, sadder undertone than its more operatic, heightened plot mechanics might initially suggest. This isn't simply a story about one bad man getting what he deserves. It's a story about how cycles of control and cruelty propagate quietly through families and relationships, hidden behind exactly the kind of polished, wealthy, picture-perfect surface the film spends its entire opening stretch luring its audience into admiring, until someone, somewhere, finds a way, however imperfect, however morally complicated, to finally break that specific link in a much longer chain. And that brings us back, finally, to the film's unsettling final scene, the one that reframes everything we've just watched as the opening chapter of something considerably larger. Millie's transformation from desperate job applicant to willing, unbothered agent of vigilante justice isn't simply a twist ending designed to set up a sequel, though it certainly accomplishes that too. It's the film's final, quiet argument about exactly how these cycles eventually get broken, not through official channels, not through courts or police investigations that consistently fail to recognize or address this kind of harm, but through exactly the kind of underground, quietly coordinated network the final scene reveals, women recognizing other women's danger and desperation, and offering, however uncomfortable the method, a path toward escape that the rest of society has consistently failed to provide. Whether you find that ending genuinely satisfying or simply unsettling probably depends on how much moral ambiguity you're willing to sit within your genre entertainment. But there's no denying the film commits fully to its own internal logic right up through that final, chilling exchange, and that commitment, more than any individual plot twist along the way, is what ultimately makes the whole thing linger in your head well after the credits roll. Let's spend a little more time, too, on where this film sits within its broader genre lineage, because understanding that context helps explain exactly why audiences responded to it the way they did. The domestic thriller built around a wealthy household harboring dark secrets has a long, established history in popular entertainment, stretching back through decades of paperback bestsellers and their accompanying film adaptations. What distinguishes the more memorable entries in this tradition isn't usually narrative originality in any strict sense. The broad beats, the wealthy family, the hired outsider, the dark secret eventually exposed, recur constantly across the genre. What distinguishes the good ones is the specificity and conviction of the execution, the willingness to fully commit to heightened, sometimes outrageous melodrama without winking at the audience so hard that the genuine emotional stakes collapse entirely into parody. This film largely succeeds at finding that balance, treating its increasingly outrageous plot developments with enough sincerity that the audience remains genuinely invested in the outcome, even while the heightened tone gives everyone permission to enjoy the sheer, escalating absurdity of it all. That's a difficult needle to thread, and it's worth recognizing that plenty of films attempting this exact tonal register fail to find it, tipping too far into either joyless self-seriousness or full, undermining camp. This film's success at locating that middle ground, mostly through Paul Feig's confident directorial hand and Amanda Seyfried's carefully calibrated central performance, is a meaningful part of why it connected with audiences as widely and as enthusiastically as it did. There's also something worth noting in how the film engages with, and ultimately subverts, the broader cultural conversation around domestic labor and class dynamics. Millie's position within the Winchester household carries an inherent power imbalance that the film is quietly attentive to throughout, the specific vulnerability of live, in domestic work, the isolation of being employed inside someone else's home with limited recourse if that employer turns out to be dangerous, the way financial desperation forecloses the option of simply walking away from a bad situation that someone with more resources and stability could leave without hesitation. The film doesn't turn this into an extended treatise on labor exploitation. It remains, first and foremost, a heightened genre thriller, but that underlying class dynamic gives the central relationships an additional layer of plausibility and weight that a story about three equally resourced, equally powerful characters wouldn't have carried nearly as effectively. Let's also examine, one more time, the specific function Cece, Nina and Andrew's young daughter, serves within the story's broader moral architecture. Cece's presence throughout the film operates as a kind of moral compass independent of the adult's increasingly complicated, increasingly compromised strategic calculations. Her insistence that her mother return for Millie, rather than simply completing their planned escape, isn't framed as childish naivety. It's framed as a genuine ethical clarity that the adults around her have, in various ways, lost access to through years of navigating cruelty, control, and survival. That detail matters, because it suggests the film isn't simply nihilistic about the moral compromises its adult characters make throughout the story. It's holding space, through Cece, for the possibility that basic decency and obligation toward others still matters, even within a story this thoroughly steeped in manipulation, violence, and compromised survival strategies. This also has implications for how we should understand Nina's character by the film's end. Her willingness to listen to her daughter, to turn back despite the very real danger that decision creates for both of them, suggests that her elaborate, ruthless plan hasn't fully calcified her into someone purely transactional and cold. There's still a version of Nina underneath all the strategic calculation capable of genuine moral reconsideration, capable of being moved by an argument about obligation and decency rather than simply self-interest. That detail, small as it is within the overall plot, does real work in keeping Nina sympathetic even after we've fully processed exactly how manipulative and dangerous her plan toward Millie actually was. Let's also revisit, briefly, the way the film handles its supporting cast more broadly, because there's a consistent thematic through line running even through characters with relatively limited screen time. Enzo, the groundskeeper whose unsettling presence triggers the broken plate that sets the film's central crisis into motion, functions as a kind of red herring throughout the story's opening stretch, his quiet, watchful demeanor suggesting, to a first-time viewer, that he might be harboring some sinister secret of his own. The film plays with this suspicion deliberately, only to reveal that his presence, while genuinely unsettling in the moment, isn't actually connected to any larger conspiracy at all. That choice is worth appreciating as a piece of narrative misdirection operating on a smaller scale alongside the film's larger twists, training the audience to suspect danger from an obvious, visually coded source, the silent, watchful outsider, while the actual danger turns out to be coming from precisely the opposite direction, the charming, socially embedded insider everyone has been trained by genre convention to trust. So when you step back and consider why this particular adaptation resonated as widely and as enthusiastically as it did, beyond simply riding the popularity of its source novel, I think the answer comes down to exactly this kind of layered, deliberate construction. Every element of the film, its setting, its supporting characters, its pacing, its tonal register, is working in service of the same central argument, that the people and situations most likely to be misread, dismissed, or condemned by conventional wisdom and surface-level judgment are often the exact ones deserving the most careful, complicated attention. That argument gets delivered through outrageous, heightened, sometimes excessive genre machinery, but it's there, consistently, underneath all the twists, giving the film a genuine thematic backbone that elevates it meaningfully above simple, disposable entertainment. Final rating, 7 out of 10. A gleefully heightened, confidently executed throwback to a beloved genre tradition, anchored by a genuinely excellent central performance, that occasionally prioritizes escalating spectacle over deeper plausibility, but never loses sight of the genuine thematic substance underneath all its twists, and earns its uncomfortable, ambiguous final note far more than its marketing as straightforward thriller fun might initially suggest. If this breakdown gave you a deeper appreciation for exactly how this film built and then dismantled your sympathies, let me know in the comments which twist actually got you. And if you want more deep dive cinematic recaps just like this one, make sure you're subscribed, because there are plenty more twisted stories left to unpack.